I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. This is the first issue of the Libertarian Angle for 2019, and I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, too, and our viewers and listeners, and wonderful best wishes for a coming new year that hopefully will see advances for liberty.
Yeah, hopefully so. And I want to thank you all for your great support that you've given us here end of year. Really puts us on some solid footing for advancing liberty in the coming year. Richard, okay, we've been away for a while over Christmas, and President Trump during that period of time announced that he was going to pull all the troops out from Syria immediately, that he had finally apparently seen the light, that these troops have no business being in Syria. They're accomplishing nothing constructive. He says that they've already defeated ISIS, which was supposedly the goal for those troops, and he brought them home. And he was going to bring them home. Well, Richard, color me skeptical. Almost immediately after he made that announcement, he announced that he was going to delay it 4 months. And that's, of course, because of the overwhelming pressure of the national security establishment. That they've always loved these foreign interventions. They create the crisis environment. They produce the enemies. They produce the terrorism, which then justifies the ever-increasing budgets. And so the last thing the national security establishment wants to do is to get out of any of these countries where these forever wars are taking place. So they've obviously pressured Trump into a 4-month delay, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if 4 months from now they come up with another excuse. Now, let me make some points here. Let's keep in mind that this is what happened with Trump and the CIA records on the JFK assassination. Those records, by law, were supposed to be released last October. Trump, all the way up to the deadline, the day before the deadline, says, I'm releasing these records, which of course was the right thing to do. And on the very next day, he announces that he's going to grant a 3-year delay, which would indicate that the CIA pressured him into keeping these records secret on the basis of, quote, national security, which is, of course, ludicrous, because a 55-year-old records, somehow or another that the U.S. is going to fall into the oceans if they're released is patently ridiculous. And not only that, but Trump over Christmas flew into Iraq under cover of darkness. Now here was supposed to be this paradise, and the president has to fly over there in secret from this paradise that the U.S. invasion and occupation put together. And he can only stay for about 15 minutes because it's so dangerous, while the president of Iran goes over there and stays in a hotel and spends several days there. Not the president of the United States. He has to do it very secretly because this paradise is so dangerous. But while he's there, he says, look, even when we get the troops out of Syria, we'll have the troops here in Iraq to send back into Syria if circumstances require it. Well, this is not a non-interventionist we're talking about. This is a guy that surrounded himself with generals the minute he got into office. He makes the CIA director the Secretary of State. This is not your classic non-interventionist. In fact, my hunch is that the only reason that he's ordering this withdrawal from Syria is just totally pragmatic reasons. That apparently the Turkish autocrat, for whom he has a lot of respect and admiration, not surprisingly, because they're very similar, that he wants to attack the Kurds. And Trump, it seems to me, is saying, okay, I'm getting out of your way here. So it's not a principled reason for withdrawing from Syria. Trump's not saying, hey, look, it was wrong for the United States to intervene in this country's revolution. It's none of the U.S. government's business. Really, it's more of a pragmatic thing of, what are we accomplishing? ISIS is defeated. And finally, let's keep in mind that ISIS has never threatened to invade the United States, and it was a direct result of the Iraq intervention. So The Iraq intervention produces ISIS, which is composed of, in large part, the Saddam Hussein's people. And Saddam Hussein. And so they're trying to get back into power. What does the United States have to do with that? It's not like these people are coming to invade and occupy the United States. So is it possible that he'll pull the troops out in 4 months? Absolutely. But I wouldn't go and bet the farm on it. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that we besides all the details that you've correctly enumerated, I think we also need to sort of step back and look at the broader canvas on which this itself is playing out. And that is, we have to understand the ideological arrogance and the material plunder that is involved in American foreign interventionist policies. First, the ideological arrogance. Since 1945, indeed since Franklin Roosevelt, and even before that Woodrow Wilson, but certainly in the post-World War II period, there has been a deep sense of internationalist arrogance on the part of the foreign policy experts, the decision makers, both political parties and their leadership, that it is the duty and the destiny of the United States to man the ramparts and be the policeman of the world. That without American leadership, the world will fall into barbaric and evil chaos. And therefore, it is necessary to have these far-flung alliances, military bases, a large number of U.S. military personnel stationed and in place in virtually every continent and multiple countries around the world. And that the United States must be able and ready to militarily intervene at any time in any situation when those in Washington consider it in the broadest sense in America's national interest to dictate and determine and maintain a certain international order, to remake the world in some minimal sense in America's image, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the list goes on, or using our proxies to fight what we view as our enemies, supporting the Saudis with military material to be able to bomb Yemen, because one of the factions in Yemen views itself as aligned with Iran, and Iran is the competitor and rival to Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, and therefore the United States has to support the side that we prefer. All of this acts as its way to suck America in to all of these regional and national and local conflicts because of this arrogant presumption that America's duty and destiny is to police and manage the world through an international order of the elite's conception and making. The other element of this, Jacob, that cannot be ignored is that there's the old adage, follow the money if you want to understand who's doing something and why. And let us recall that the U.S. government spends hundreds of billions of dollars each year on its U.S. military budget. This is the financial rice bowl of the diplomats, the senior military leadership in the Pentagon, the justification and rationales for spending those tens of billions, those hundreds of billions of dollars on contracts for equipment, ammunition, uniforms, commissaries, and all of the businesses that then depend upon those dollars being spent in their surrounding communities in a rippling effect. So you have this huge spider's web of special interest groups, beginning with the military echelon itself. You know, if you don't need generals, then you may be out of a job if you're a general. Beginning with that, but all the way down the spider's web of vested interests who become dependent upon the particular disbursement and spending of all of these tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars in certain patterns and sequences that influence profitability, where businesses operate, the people to be employed, the suppliers who then feed into them, so those companies can directly feed into serving the demands and contracts of the U.S. government. This is the nature of the beast. Material self-interest to keep the U.S. tax dollars being spent in the directions where those special interest groups will gain, all directly and indirectly connected with the military budget in the broader sense. And then this ideological arrogance that not only is this good for America financially, but it is our destiny to remake the world, which means anything that happens in the world is potentially something that will be drawing American lives and the political situation in the United States into a vortex of every conflict anywhere on any of the continents. This is perpetual war for perpetual peace. And all of the details that you gave about the specificity of Trump doing this or not doing that is all the foreground against the wider canvas background of these ideological and material interests at work.
Yeah, and as you've pointed out in previous discussions, I mean, this is just central planning on a global scale. I mean,
yes.
we all know what central planning has done. It produces crisis. It produces what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos, certainly on a domestic level where they're planning economic activity. But here, when they're planning global affairs, the chaos and the crises are there too. I mean, it's amazing to me, Richard, that anybody can still be an interventionist. It's just phenomenal to me. Look what they've done. I mean, look what they've done to Iraq. They've destroyed the entire country. I mean, it's just a hellhole. They've got a corrupt regime running the thing. That's a dictatorial regime. In principle, it's no different from Saddam Hussein's regime. They produced ISIS as a result of this, which then gave them the justification for more interventionism. All of this is done without a declaration of war, as the Constitution requires. So there's this denigration of America's legal process.
Yes.
Look at Syria. They were over there encouraging that revolution in Syria because they don't give a hoot about how many people die in these things. They certainly don't care how many Iraqis they've killed. They don't even keep count of the people they kill because it doesn't matter. There's never an upward limit on the number of people that's too many. And this was expressed by Madeleine Albright back in the 90s, a Democrat under Bill Clinton. She was U.S. ambassador to the UN. When 60 Minutes asked her, well, what about the deaths of 500,000 children, Iraqi children, from the sanctions that the U.S. and the UN were enforcing? She says, oh, yeah, it's a difficult thing, but it's worth it. Because that's their mindset. So I don't know how many people have been killed in Syria now, about 500,000 or so, with this quest of getting regime change. I mean, that's always the quest, to get a pro-U.S. regime in these countries. You got 500,000 people that are now dead. And again, U.S. intervening there with no declaration of war against Syria. And this nonsense of, oh, we're there to stop ISIS and all this. They are there to pressure the Assad regime into abdicating power or to encourage the revolution there. And that's what this has always been about, regime change in Syria, which is ironic also because the CIA partnered with the deep state in Syria to torture a Canadian citizen named Mahar Arar, a guy who was totally innocent, and yet the CIA renditioned him to Syria. We don't know how the deal was cut. We don't know the terms of the deal. We don't know if the president signed off on it. But, you know, this is the machinations of U.S. foreign policy. It's total disaster. Look at Libya, where Hillary Clinton goes and cackles, oh, we came, we saw, and he died. And she was just laughing about it. And yet, look how many people have died there from that intervention. Look at Afghanistan, this longest war now in U.S. history. Troops are still there killing and dying for what? I mean, the Taliban controls about 60% of the country, and the proponents of continued occupation say, oh, well, if the Taliban takes over, it'll be a sanctuary again for terrorists. Well, I hate to give them the bad news, but if that's the rationale, 60% of the country is under Taliban rule and therefore subject to this sanctuary principle. I mean, it's this whole concept, Richard, of foreign interventionism. It's an absolute disaster. You can go back to the Spanish-American War, where the shift took place toward foreign empire, interventionism, where you end up controlling Cuba, you end up killing hundreds of thousands of people in the Philippines who were fighting for their independence, first from Spain and then from the U.S. You look at World War I, which gave rise to Hitler in World War II. Okay, they defeated Hitler in World War II, but they end up delivering all of Eastern Europe, half of Germany into the Soviet communists, who had been America's partner and ally, which is then used as the excuse for the Cold War and the monumental shift to a national security state, which gives us the CIA, the Pentagon, the NSA with surveillance and torture and assassination, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, ultimately, destruction of America's principles and values with secret surveillance and torture and assassination, and then, of course, the Persian Gulf intervention, followed by the sanctions, and then the terrorist blowback. I mean, it just never stops. How is it possible for anyone to still be an interventionist after this continual state of disasters?
Well, I think that it's basically for the same reason that you see in domestic policies, that no matter how disastrous and misguided and worsening the welfare state may create the situation for many in the society, or the financial burdens that it may impose upon the taxpayers in general, with $22 trillion of debt, and then hundreds of trillions of dollars more in unfunded liability for Social Security and Medicare and so on, there is this idea that it's not the policy that has failed. It hasn't been implemented correctly with the right leadership, or enough dollars has not been spent. There's a cognitive dissonance in this. That is an unwillingness to accept the reality of the situation, because it would require you to rethink your premises. And if you had to rethink your premises, it would radically undercut your entire worldview, which you're not ready to accept. And you wouldn't even know how to then act or react if you attempted to do so, because the conceptual terrain would be so foreign and alien to you. You mean a world without American leadership? Why, it will be chaos. Why, an America without a redistributive welfare state? Well, there'll be people dying in the streets, and no health care or retirement. That they'll just be in the streets. This inability to imagine a world without these interventionist states, either domestic and particularly the foreign that we're talking about, creates this fear of even considering the alternative in the face of failures. And if I can just make one other point, which we've sometimes talked about, and that is that the reason why this gets perpetuated in this way, another dimension of this, is there's the old adage, Jacob, that the friend of my enemy is my enemy. As soon as the United States intervenes into the domestic political and military affairs of any other country, it by necessity is picking sides. Otherwise, why would we be intervening? They're the, quote, good guys and the bad guys, and we've decided to support what we're defining as the good guys, which means immediately the people we've categorized as the bad guys now view us also as the enemy, besides their domestic rivals, because their domestic rivals are now dependent upon or receiving extra military and other assistance from the United States to defeat those we've called the bad guys. Now, this means that there's this never-ending cycle that every time we intervene, we create many of the very enemies that we then use as a justification for saying, well, of course we can't get out. Look, we have enemies. It's not, are there nuts who just hate America? Of course there are. But the vast majority of the resistance and anger and blowback that we have experienced is basically because our very actions and interventions have generated a resentment and anger, a desire to get back at the force that seems to be defeating them in their own homeland. In other words, many, if not most, of these terrorist attacks have nothing to do with, well, they just hate us. As I said, of course there may be who are nuts and just hate something, but it's basically a response to our interventions into their nation's affairs, which seems to them unfair, disturbing the playing field of the domestic conflict against them, and therefore they view us as the enemy to fight as much as their domestic opponent.
Yeah, your point about people having been born and raised under this kind of system, I think is so important, because you've got two separate elements working here. You've got the concept of foreign interventionism, And then you've got the concept of the national security state, which the federal government was converted to after World War II. And those two principles, concepts, go together. Now, they don't necessarily go together, because you can have a national security state that isn't going abroad and intervening in every nation's problems. I mean, Pakistan is a national security state. Egypt is a national security state. North Korea is a national security state. China is, and so is the U.S. post-World War II. But everybody living today has been born and raised under these two concepts. So
Yes.
when we libertarians say, hey, look, let's get rid of the foreign interventionism, it just shocks people. Oh my gosh, what if the Soviets get undue influence in Syria? What if they're controlling the Syria regime or have tremendous influence over it? Or what if China gets undue influence and control over African countries or Latin American countries? Well, of course, the libertarian answer is, so what? What difference does it make? Well, that just shocks people. I mean, they talk in terms of empire speak. We need a counterbalancing force here to counteract our rivals in the economic sphere. China is a rising rival. It's just ridiculous empire speak. As you point out, military spending has always gone through the roof, precisely because of all these interventions which then produce the so-called enemies that they then have to protect us from. I was reading today where the military now is spending the total of the next 7 countries combined. and it's still not enough. They still want more. If you look at a country like Switzerland, which in my opinion has the model foreign policy, which is defend the country itself. I mean, everything in Switzerland is designed to just defend Switzerland. So, in an event of emergency, everybody knows where to go. Everybody's armed. Every family's armed to the teeth, or practically every family. And everything's oriented to defense. That's what defense really means. So you don't see Switzerland getting embroiled in whether somebody's got influence in Syria or the Russians are gaining influence over here. It doesn't matter to them. They let these other nations play that empire game. They're not in the Middle East killing people. They're not in Afghanistan. They don't want to embroil themselves. They are limited to defense. Their Department of Defense is not a Department of Intervention, war, of aggression, occupation like the U.S. Department of Defense. Their Department of Defense is truly limited to defense. Well, once you do that, Richard, then you start asking the question. You certainly don't need all the overseas troops anymore. You bring them home immediately from everywhere and you discharge them. But then the other question is, what do you need a big military establishment here at home for? The U.S. is not under threat of invasion or occupation by some foreign country. There's no country in the world that's even got the resources to even think about invading or occupying the U.S. And the two oceans are a great protection. So what are we doing with this national security state? It was brought into existence because of the Cold War. Cold War ended 25 years ago. Then it's time to start asking another question. Why not restore a limited government republic to our land? Why not ditch the national security state? And we end up with that same confrontation. Oh my gosh, Jacob, what would we do without the CIA? How could we survive as a nation without the NSA and the Pentagon and this huge empire of domestic military bases and installations? Well, again, it's because everybody's been born and raised under that system. They've lost the concept or never had the concept of what it's like to live in a limited government republic.
Yes, and this is why it is so important not to fall into these traps of, well, maybe this intervention is not necessarily in our interest, but there are others that are. There has to be a whole rethinking of the nature of what government is for. Of course, classical liberals, libertarians, particularly talk about this at the domestic level. Should the government be regulating private enterprise? Should the government be redistributing wealth through the welfare state mechanisms and so on? But it has to be the similar type of root and branch rethinking of interventionism abroad as well. Is it necessary in the name of protecting the life, liberty, and honestly acquired property of American citizens within the United States to have these far-flung empire bases and troop locations in the name of protecting America's liberty. Is this what government is supposed to do? Is it pragmatically even necessary? And is it the society of freedom? Because as we've also talked about in the past, as the state extends its reach abroad and creates enemies that are the blowback against the United States due to our interventions, that then becomes the rationale. Well, you see, they're coming here to the homeland. Don't we need a national security agency? Don't we need to beef up the FBI? Don't we need to be surveillancing people? Because, you know, somewhere out there in the haystack is the needle, and the needle is the terrorist who might do damage. And therefore, the entire haystack has to become under the surveillancing eye of the U.S. security agencies in the name of finding one hypothetical needle that might do a bad thing. But if the needle is in the haystack, it's due to our very interventions abroad that place it there. That is the blowback effect. So if we want to diminish just pragmatically the need for these types of security agencies and intrusions into our privacy, it will occur naturally as a complement to the diminished American intervention in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think it's an absolute prerequisite to a free society. And these individuals that say, well, okay, it's good to get out of Syria, but we've got to reserve the ability to intervene when it's in our interests. Well, they've just given the case away. Because guess who decides what's in our interests? It's the president who makes that decision. And I guarantee you, in every one of these interventions, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, you know, the list goes, Latin America, the list goes on and on. In every one of them, the president believed that it was in our interests. So there's got to be a dividing line, and that dividing line is the protection of the United States against an invasion or occupation. Stay out of these foreign interventions and don't give them any kind of leeway in this area. That way we raise people's vision to a higher level here. Okay, so Trump, let's say he succeeds in getting these troops out of Syria. Well, he's still got troops in Iraq. He still has troops in Afghanistan. Okay, let's say he pulls out half the troops in Afghanistan. Well, he's got troops in Africa. I mean, you know, what good does it do to have somebody in office that's going to be sitting there saying, well, okay, we'll pull over here and we'll push them over here. You still got the same problem. And as you point out, that is destroying our freedom at home because they use the threats that they produce, this terrorist blowback, as the reason is, oh, we've got to keep you safe. We need the TSA at the airports to pat you down and search you. We need the NSA to do secret surveillance on you to make sure that you're being kept safe. We need the CIA to be assassinating people and torturing people to keep you safe. Well, it's all to keep us safe from the enemies that their policies are producing. And so if you get rid of the interventionism, the level of threat diminishes, dissipates, where all of a sudden people start asking that question, what do we need you guys for? Because that, remember, people were essentially asking that question at the end of the Cold War. They called it a peace dividend, but they were talking in terms of massive reductions in military spending and CIA spending and NSA spending, because that was the reason why America, the federal government, was converted to a national security state in the first place. If you don't have the justification, the Cold War, then what do you need the national security establishment for? And I think that's why this thing's a big racket, Richard. You know, I love that book by General Smedley Butler, you know, War is a Racket. Well, it's really this foreign policy of interventionism that's the racket, because it guarantees ever-increasing budgets for the military, the CIA, the NSA, and this huge army of contractors and people who are dependent on this military largesse, dole its welfare, military welfare, either directly dependent on it or indirectly dependent by virtue of having businesses next to bases and so forth. That's the racket here that we've got to bring to a stop.
We should also, in this context, remember the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. They wanted to divide and limit powers. In one sense, both their own in Congress, given that the Senate has certain responsibilities, the House has other certain responsibilities. One can be a check on the other. and that is counterbalanced by an executive, but both branches are a check on the executive and so on. But this involved war as well. If one reads James Madison's account of the Constitutional Convention, what you find out is that when they were coming to the issue of war and who should have authority and power to do this, some wanted it to be in the hands of the chief executive, the president. But it was argued that no, this would be too dangerous, too arbitrary, too discretionary. There must be a limit. Well, there needs to be a declaration of war. There has to be a rationale and a justification and a demonstration that there has been a threat. We want to, as they said, one of the representatives said, we want to clog the avenues to war, not open them up. Another way of saying this is that, often people say, well, of course, the government is doing this badly at home or abroad, but if only our party was in or our politically preferred candidate was in. I would ask anyone to just imagine this. Think for a moment of the politician who you trust the least and hurt the most. Trust the least and fear the most. And just imagine that person is holding the power of the presidency. Democratic elections occur. One person is in, another person is out. There's going to be a new person in after 8 years because no president under the Constitution can hold more than 2 terms. So you never know who's going to be in power. And do you want the reins of discretionary authority outside of the traditional spirit of the Constitution to be able to just send American military personnel and to allocate budgetary foreign aid of military and other types to just governments around the world and therefore threaten to suck us in to an unending stream of these conflicts? The Founding Fathers were imperfect people, and no document or institution is always perfect either as a reflection of our imperfections as human beings, but their spirit and their intent and the purpose of this structure of the Constitution was to see that these types of foreign adventures either did not occur, but were either minimized or able to be brought home in short order.
Yeah, and one of the main reasons for that was encapsulated in James Madison's famous quote. He was, of course, the crafter of the Constitution, where he said, of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest. And he's talking about the federal government, your own government, becoming your enemy of liberty, because it has all of the infringements on liberty that generally come anyway, that war magnifies them, it concentrates them, it makes the government that much more powerful that then destroys your freedom at home. And that's why Madison says war is the biggest enemy of liberty, because that enemy comes from within, not from without.
Yes.
So, okay, on that note, Richard, we're out of time. Enjoyed visiting with you on here, the first libertarian angle of the new year, and look forward to doing it with you some more during the course of the year.
And goodbye to all of our viewers and listeners, and once more, a happy new year.
Yep, thank you again for reviewing. Thanks for your great support. We really are appreciative, and a happy new year to every one of you.